Hello, hello, hello. This is the Barbara Cox Show. Today's question: are you willing to wait until your appointed time to speak? Ecclesiastic 3:1 says that there's a time to speak. It says that there is a time to speak, meaning that there's a precise time for you to speak. There is a time when the vision shall speak. The Lord tells us to write the vision down. So as we write the vision down, the vision becomes nonverbal at that point. It's verbalized through written expression, but not through an outward expression, through a spoken expression. It's through a written expression. He says to write it down. So you write the vision down so that you can get clarification. I remember going through something and God began to tell me precisely everything that I had to do. And so I, with haste, began to write it down. I wrote it down in a notebook that I kept near me, and I began to go back to that note, and I would reference that vision. I would reference what God had spoken into my life at that appointed time, because I was going through a season when I had no clue of what to do. And this is a true story. This is not make-believe. This is a true story. I actually did write it down. As I heard it in the spirit realm, I wrote it down. Everything that God told me, word from word, I wrote it down. Note from note, dream from dream. If it was given to me in a dream, I wrote it down. If it was given to me in an open vision, I wrote it down. I began to precisely write down everything that God had told me that I would have to do to make it through that season of my life. I wrote down everything that God had told me to direct me to the footprints that He had already laid in the path and the sand of life. This thing called life requires you to write down the vision that God has given you, because it directs you to those ordained footprints that are placed there in the sand of life. This thing called life, you cannot make it unless you're hearing from the voice of God. You're not going to make it to those ordained steps that He has for you, because He orders your steps. But in order for you to know the next step, the next movement, the next dimension, the next level, you have got to hear the voice of God, and you have got to at some point write that vision down. And then you make it so plain that anybody could read it. Anyone. I want to say even a child. That's just how plain and explicit it should be, so that anyone that reads it can run with it. Because your vision that is given to you is not just for you. The blessing that God has given you is not just catered just for you. Now, the blessing has your name on it, but there are people that are attached to you that's going to receive a blessing as well. You are a blessing to be a blessing. So you must write it down and make it plain so that anybody can run with it. But there's a precise time when that vision will speak, because if you allow that vision to speak ahead of time, then you may interfere with the timing of your vision. Nothing can stop it, but it can be delayed. It won't be denied, but you can delay it by simply giving out more information than what is necessary for the timing. It's all about the timing, and it's the timing of God. And so God tells you to write it down. So then you write it down. And you go back and you do like a checklist where you begin to check off everything that God has told you to do. And you begin to look at that thing, and you begin to meditate on that thing. And you begin to allow that thing to penetrate into your heart. And that's exactly the way you do God's word. A lot of times when I would read God's word, as I was reading it, I was writing it down, because I was writing down His vision that He had for my life through His word. And then I would study it. I would meditate on it. I would memorize Bible verses, but not just so that I could quote them, but so that they would be hid in my heart. I would memorize the vision that God had for me so that it would hide in my heart, and that I would not sin against him. Because there are things in God's word that you may not be aware of that he has for your life. There were things in God's word that I was not even aware of, like the not to murmur or complain. I had no idea that was even part of God's vision. He doesn't want us to murmur. He doesn't want us to complain. And then my favorite scriptures, which you'll always hear me saying, is the Deuteronomy 28, the side of the blessings. Because you've got the blessings and you've got the curses. But I'm not talking about the curses. I'm talking about the blessings that he has for your life. As long as you walk upright, there's nothing he'll keep from you. And you begin to meditate on those blessings where he says that you're the head, where he says that you're above, where he says you're blessed going inward, you're blessed going into the city, and then you're blessed coming outward, you're blessed coming out of the country. He talks about the blessings that he has for your life. Where you can even write those visions down. Those are visions that God has for your life. And you go back and you check that list. You check those visions and you begin to wait on God for an appointed time. Those visions that he's giving you shall speak. So today, are you willing to wait for the precise appointed time to speak? There is an appointed time to speak, and there is a mandatory time to be silent. Let me say that again. God's speaking through me, y'all. He said there's a appointed time to speak, and there's a mandatory time to be silent. So that means that in our silence, we will receive a blessings. Because if we don't be silent, then it can cause a conflict with the speaking of the vision. There has to be a mandatory time when you are so silent and allow that vision to speak and see the manifestation of God. In order for the manifestation, there's a mandatory time of silence. Because I do know that in his word, he talks about us not being like a rash, like our mouth is not being like a rash. Because we continue to talk about things that God has not ordained us to talk about, or talk at a time when we shouldn't be talking, then that can cause a conflict that begins to cause a problem with that vision itself speaking. I just wonder, can the vision speak if there's no mandatory time of silence? Because a lot of times I think that during our silent time, that's when we're hearing more and more from God. And how can you know your vision if you're not hearing it from God? And I think that a lot of times when we're speaking and it's not our appointed time, then we're blocking the hearing of God. Because he's a gentleman. His voice is a still small voice that speaks to you sometime in the wee hours of the mornings. And that's why I know that the times when I hear God's voice is during those times when I'm normally asleep. And so that's why I know that when God speaks to you, he's going to speak to you at a time when you are quiet. But then there's a mandatory time for you to be quiet and not speak out what God has spoken into your ear until there's a precise time. And there's a time when he'll tell you when to speak, and there's a time when he'll tell you not to speak. And the reason why it's mandatory is because a lot of times we're hearing it, but we don't know that that's not the time to speak it. And then God begins to tell us to be still, to be quiet. And I'm gonna tell you that was a hard thing for me at some point in my life, was to be quiet, because I love to talk. There was a time when I was real shy, but then God gave me this boldness, but he had to tell me when to be still. He had to tell me when to be quiet. And then y'all know it's hard to control that tongue without the Spirit of God. So it's mandatory that we be silent until that appointed time for us to speak. The blessings comes during that time, because that's when you're blessed to hear more and more from God. So it's mandatory that we be still and that we be quiet and we hear from God. And then the moment we hear from God, like I think about the woman at the well. I think about when she went to the well. She had been going to the well. And she would go with this water pot and she would fill it with water. And as she would fill it with water, I just feel that there was a heaviness on her. Because she had to take this heavy water pot and she had to carry it. The heaviness of that water pot. But when she went to the well, she began to hear a voice that she had never heard before. She had to be still. She had to be quiet to hear what the voice was telling her. She met a man at that well that spoke into her life and that poured into her life to where the heaviness was no longer. She no longer had to carry that heaviness, because now what God has given her through his son, Jesus Christ, would now live in her. She no longer had to carry it on the outward side, because it now lived on the inside. But it was mandatory that she was there at that well at that precise time. And it was very imperative that she would stand still there. And it was mandatory that she would listen. And it was mandatory that she would hear what God was saying to her. And they began to have a conversation. And there was a appointed time where she had to speak. But there was an appointed time where she had to be silent and she had to listen. But the moment that the entire encounter was over at the well, there was a precise time where she had to run. And she had to tell what had been spoken into her spirit realm. She had to run and she had to release the vision. She had to speak it as she began to run through the city. And she began to tell them about a man that had changed her life. About a man that was not like any man that she had met. It was like no man that she had ever encountered in her entire life. She began to reveal to the city, to the people, to everyone she came in contact with, the spoken vision. So there has to be a time where you be silent and you stand at that well and you hear the voice of God. And then there's a precise time where you can run and tell that. You can run and tell that what God has done for you. You can run and tell how the Lamb, the Jesus Christ, has touched you. How when you went to a place empty, but now you're full. You're so full till you no longer carry that heaviness. There's an appointed time for the vision to be written down, and there's an appointed time for that vision to speak. Today, are you willing to wait on that appointed time to speak? Are you willing to wait on that appointed time? I know I am, because I've gone through times when I went out of the will of God and I began to speak and I began to do things out of the flesh, operating from the flesh, speaking from the flesh. And I began to run into obstacles. And then I would cry out to God, help me out of this situation. Help me to bypass this obstacle that is hindering me. And because of the love of God and because of his righteousness, He allowed me to come out of that situation.